Well, good evening and Happy New Year. Lovely to see you all. It's not quite 6 o'clock, but we've got a full house already, so we might as well start. Message from the management up front that when we come to exit, please go out the back door because there's something happening out the front. I'm not quite sure what. Topic, of course, is crime. For those who weren't around in the 1950s, a couple of lovely boys here, the Cray twins. Very nice to their mothers, I'm assured. Maybe not so nice to everybody else. Now, there are many people who say that you cannot have a science of criminology because there is no agreement as to what is crime. Using a mobile phone in an auditorium that rings might be considered a crime by some. If you know the Gothic melodrama, Ruddigore, the man who inherits the title of Baronet of Ruddigore inherits with it a curse that he must commit one crime per day or perish in agony. And there's a scene where the new incumbent to the baronetcy is being grilled by the ghosts of his ancestors as to how he's getting on with this requirement. And he says, well, yesterday I fiddled my income tax. And they say, no, that's not a crime. Everybody does that. And he said, well, today I shot a fox. And they sort of nod, pass the fox. Because, of course, no English gentleman would shoot a fox. He would have it torn apart by a pack of dogs. So that's a crime in that particular context. One of the things we need to do is distinguish crime from vice, where laws are a great deal more variable. Activities that are engaged in just to satisfy your personal pleasures, however immoral and degrading they might be, are not necessarily outlawed. It varies from time and place. In some countries, homosexuality will get you hanged. In Britain, homophobia is more likely to get you into trouble. Some countries like Australia and New Zealand have legal prostitution. In Britain, it is driven underground. There are, in the United States, some states outlaw marijuana, others have recently legalized it. So anything that comes under the general heading of vice has highly variable laws pertaining to it. Whereas certain other things like murder, assault, robbery, rape, perhaps paedophilia, which involve the intent to harm other people, or that necessarily do involve the harm of other people, are crimes anywhere you go in the world. So that is the kind of crime that we're concerned with. Incidentally, anti-vice laws are very often counterproductive. The great experiment being prohibition in the United States, which created many more problems than it set out to solve. The cure was worse than the disease, as they say. And decriminalization of homosexuality, pornography, adultery in some parts of the world, prostitution, abortion has not resulted in the total collapse of society as some people might have feared. There might come a time when we regard the war against drugs as another experiment that failed, because we never seem to learn the lesson that trying to control vice by legal processes is not effective. It's a job for the church, probably. A great many risk factors have been identified, which are characteristics that precede delinquency and crime. Some of them apply particularly to men, others particularly to women. They're generally rather unsurprising correlates, which will tell us very little about cause and effect. And to give you an example, things like parental separation and conflict, or child abuse, may actually create crime and delinquency in the offspring, but they could equally well reflect a genetic connection between the parents and the child, manifested in feckless or violent behavior. And that fact that a correlation does not imply cause and effect is something that I'll be mentioning several times this evening. There's a very popular belief that crime is a result of poverty or deprivation, but there is remarkably little support for this. There is no clear connection between the two. If you take changes in the economic status quo from one time to another, you find that it is not obviously followed by a predictable shift in crime levels. Crime in the UK increased most sharply between 1950 and 1970, corresponding with a very positive economic outlook. I think it was Harold Macmillan who said, "We have never had it so good." And now, of course, it is said that we have terrible austerity, that there are cutbacks and benefits, and there are food banks and all this kinds of thing, and yet crime seems to be falling, most types of crime anyway. Another idea is that it's not the absolute levels of poverty, but the relative poverty that is important. And again, if anything, inequality, economically speaking, tends to relate inversely to crime levels, at least across nations. What is certainly true is that social problems of every kind, poverty, deprivation, unemployment, drugs, everything you like to imagine, tends to congregate within the same neighborhood. And that can give you the illusion that one is causing the other. But it would be simple-minded to think that was the case. I mean, the neighborhoods that have high crime levels are also neighborhoods that have Labour councils. But there aren't too many sociologists who would argue that voting Labour is the cause of crime. The London riots were interesting in that some commentators tried to say that it was because of terrible poverty in London that all this looting occurred, that it was inevitable. But in fact, if you look at what they were actually stealing, it was things like flat-screen televisions, iPads, and designer trainers, not the sort of thing that you might need if you were starving to death or your children were. The probability is that envy or entitlement is a word that's often been used to describe this phenomenon, or just plain excitement. Nothing else to do. It's a nice summer night. You've seen it all happening on television. Might as well get out there and join the party. Seems to be a better explanation than poverty or deprivation. I went to a conference in Sicily on crime, and we had to have a machine gun security man protecting us from the mafia, who were not happy about this conference going on. But I flew out with a sociologist from Glasgow, I think it was, who was telling me that his theory of crime, that it was actually a justifiable response to the inequities of society. And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to discuss the personality and genetics of criminal behavior." So obviously we didn't have a lot to talk about after that. Unemployment, often reckoned to be a cause of crime. Again, the connection is very unclear. I mean, it's pretty obvious that petty criminals are very often out of a job, but if you look at changing levels of unemployment within society, they are not followed by predictable alterations in the crime rate. Here's unemployment charted in connection with various types of crime in the United States. And you can see that crime has sort of followed a rainbow, inverted U kind of pattern over the years between 1960 and today. But unemployment has been up and down all over the place. And it's very difficult to see that the changes in unemployment are affecting the crime levels of any type of crime, property or otherwise, within the United States. Much the same applies in the UK. And there are some remarkable counterexamples. When Chavez was in charge of Venezuela between 1999 and quite recently, unemployment was halved, which he would have been very proud of as a socialist, but the murder rate actually tripled. So again, the connection between the two is by no means predictable. Now, another suggestion is that it doesn't matter what the actual poverty is, that what really matters is perceived unfairness. If you think that others around you have got a better deal than yourself, then that might prompt you to crime. In fact, you could say it's the commie agitators theory, that if the people out there saying that others have got it better than you, what are you going to do about it, then that might be a stimulus to crime. Again, very hard to support that across nations. The man who attempted to test it back in the 1980s could not find any predictable link. What has been observed is that wage discrepancies in different counties within the United States do seem to predict crime, property crime rates, also violent crime rates, but I haven't given you the graph for that. It's the property crime that you might expect to increase. When you have an area that is mixed ethnically and economically, when you're rubbing shoulders with people whose lot might be very much better than your own, and you can see that you're not keeping up with the Joneses, then you might be motivated to engage in criminal activity. So that's the nearest that we can get to a sociological or economic theory of the motivation for crime. Now, the Cambridge Institute of Criminology recently did an interesting study in which they followed 700 youth at risk, if you like, within the Peterborough area over a period of 10 years. And their conclusion was that there was a tiny band of only about 4% of these teenagers who were responsible for half of all the offending that took place. That minority of 4% accounted for, on average, 278 crimes by the time they'd reached 16. And they were rather versatile in the sense that they didn't just specialize in one particular crime, like smashing phone boxes, or they would do the lot. They would have a sort of wide spectrum of criminal activities. And they themselves admitted that they had no concern about consequences, no conscience of any sort, no self-control. They could see that they were impulsive people. Whereas the majority that were law-abiding said, well, they had plenty of opportunity to engage in these delinquent acts, but they didn't do so, primarily because they just saw it as morally wrong. They had what you might call a moral compass. And my mentor, Hans Eysenck, way back in 1964, wrote a book on personality and crime, and he theorized that crime was down to poor emotional conditioning, Pavlovian-type conditioning, fear conditioning, and that this is equivalent to what we call a weak conscience. Now, there's one study that does seem to support that quite well, a study of 1,795 Mauritian children. And they had measured their galvanic skin response conditioning to a loud noise at the age of 3. And obviously, some children are more conditionable than others. They came back to the same cohort at the age of 23, managed to find 137 of them had acquired a criminal record. So they compared that 137 against a sample of 274 non-criminals that came out of the same cohort, matched them for sex, ethnicity, social adversity, matched them for everything they could, and found that the criminal group showed much less fear conditioning, which is what we're seeing here. This is the failure of fear conditioning within the criminal group here, whereas there is conditioning to the conditioned stimulus in the comparison non-criminal sample. Supporting the idea that a failure of the fear conditioning that we call conscience may contribute to delinquency and indeed criminality in young adulthood. And the authors themselves implicated the amygdala, which is a fear center in the brain, and the prefrontal part of the brain, which is where conscience and self-control tends to be located, implying that there might have been some kind of brain function, dysfunction, that was causing this lack of fear conditioning. Now, it is possible that there were experiences before the age of 3 that could have been responsible for that, but to some extent it might have been the brain that you were born with. Oops, going the wrong way here. Another quite popular theory of crime is the idea that the absence of the father is unhelpful, lacking a male role model. It's very difficult to get non-correlational evidence for that, which is what ideally we would seek. And of course, you can't do the ideal experiment of assigning children randomly to parents that you have chosen, some one parent and some with both parents, but you can do it with mice. And the California mice are a strain of mice that normally do operate with 2 parents, bringing up the young mice. And so they compared mice that had been deprived of their father with equivalent mice raised by both parents. And they found that there were certain social deficits, most obviously increased aggressiveness in the father-deprived mice. They also were able to observe structural changes in the medial prefrontal areas of the brain. And that at least is consistent with human studies that will show that the absence of a father tends to go with daughters who are very susceptible to drug addiction and drug abuse. Is it watching too much TV that makes criminals? Well, there's a study coming out of New Zealand which followed children between the ages of 5 and 15 and showed that the amount of antisocial behavior and aggression by the time they'd reached young adulthood correlated with the amount of time that they had spent watching television. It applied to both male and female teenagers. And it applied after they'd controlled for IQ and social class, which would have been one of the most likely criticisms of the study. It's a longitudinal study that is consistent with a causal relationship, but again, you can't exclude all possible mediating factors. For example, although they were of the same class in IQ, the TV viewing crowd might have had more antisocial parents, or it might have been something in themselves that was causing them to disobey parental instructions not to watch so much TV. Go to bed now, you've turned that TV off. If they are of an anti-social predisposition, they might just refuse to obey their parents. Now, there is a correlation between the amount of lead in the atmosphere. We've taken lead out of petrol these days and out of paint, so there's much less of it about. And there has been evidence growing for a long time that lead in the environment is linked to a number of problems, like it impairs IQ and increases the likelihood of attention deficit disorder. So it's quite feasible that it could affect various forms of crime and delinquency. Now, this graph comes from a study of these people, whose name I won't attempt to pronounce, and with various American cities monitoring the amount of lead in the atmosphere and comparing it with the amount of violent, aggravated assault, is what they're actually showing here. And you notice that the curves are pretty much on top of each other, pretty much synonymous, provided that you shunt the one 22 years in relation to the other. In other words, you assume that the lead is doing its damage around the time of birth or the early years, and that it's going to be manifested in violence 22 years later. Now, of course, they've fitted that up. They have observed that if you push the data along 22 years, then you get a perfect relationship between aggravated assault and the amount of lead in the atmosphere 22 years earlier. And they say that this explained 90% of the variance. Now, I should say that the word explained is a statistical concept, which means it can account for it. It doesn't necessarily mean, again, that you have a causal connection between one and the other. But there is a very close association between the two. Now, the study is very impressive, very persuasive, but I would say that it would have been nice if they had just done the same thing with a number of other theoretical bases of crime, like the aging population is one, tougher policing, or the increased incarceration, which you have both in the UK and America. Higher numbers of people being sent to jail. And it would have been nice to see if you fitted some of those things against the aggravated assault rate, whether you could have come out with patterns quite as pretty as this. Nevertheless, lead remains a possible contributor to violent crime in particular. There are other things that might account for the decline of crime over the last decade or two. It seems that the opportunity to commit crime is one of the driving forces. Crime will flourish if it is made easy to do. And that's why the police are always talking about locking your windows and not leaving things on display in the car, because it actually does. It might say that they're denying criminal responsibility for these things, that ideally you ought to be able to leave your house open and leave your laptop lying in the back seat of the car. But the fact is that the easier it is for people to commit crime, the more of it they commit. And modern technology has been making certain crimes a great deal more difficult. One of the crime types that has fallen most sharply is stealing cars. And of course, cars were once very easy to steal. You could open them with a coat hanger. But now we have sophisticated alarm systems, immobilizers, so you start the car and it It stops 100 yards down the road. We've got trackers so they can find where it's gone. We've got automatic number plate recognition so that if a car is reported stolen, then the police will probably be onto you pretty quickly. So that will no doubt account for that very sharp decline in theft of motor vehicles. Then we've got burglar alarms, DNA analysis, CCTV, mobile phone location techniques. Apparently, they would be able to tell where any of us had been according to where our mobile phone had been, even if it's switched off, I think. So all of these things increase the likelihood of burglars getting caught and serve as a major deterrent. The other thing is that a lot of the household items, which people famously used to steal, are now so cheap that it's hardly worth it, because you'd get £5 down at the pub at best, and you might as well not bother. So instead you go on to different types of crime, like card fraud and web scams, where you can make vast amounts of money from people, because the technology hasn't caught up with it, and there are people out there who will fall for almost anything. CCTV is interesting in that it does serve as a deterrent and helps in the detection of crimes that have occurred, however intrusive it is and however much we feel that our privacy is being invaded. CCTV has done something a little bit beyond getting you tickets for parking in the wrong place, although it does even more of that, I have to say. But what it also does, of course, is alter the uniform of the burglars, so they wear hoodies now as well as gloves in midsummer. And it will apparently deflect crime to other places. And there was this study by Nettle and company at the university campus, I think it might have been Newcastle, in which they put up this sign above a bicycle rack where there had been a lot of bicycle thefts. And they noted that putting up the sign led to a 62% decrease in the number of bicycles stolen at the 3 locations where they put up the signs. But there was a similar increase in bicycle theft at equivalent places that did not have the signs. So it was, you still had the bike thieves, it's just that they were going somewhere else because these watching eyes were deterring them. It is interesting that this watching eyes effect has been used in many other circumstances. Whenever people feel that they are being watched, even if it's an illusion, they do seem to be on better behavior. So, you know, a lot of the CCTV cameras are not actually functional. Some of them are dummies and so on. But if you feel that you're being observed, then you might behave yourself a bit better. Some big advances at the moment in what is called pre-crime forecasting. And it's a little bit like weather reports. You predict in advance where the next crime is going to happen. It works particularly well for burglary, mugging, and car theft, street crimes, you might say. And the hot spots, as they're called, these are the hot spots showing on the map, which would have been on this map. You see, here's the hot spots. That one is that one, that one is that one, and so on. This is an area of the greater Los Angeles. The hotspots are not identical to previous occurrences, the last lot of offences. They are very often near repeats. That is, when a house has been burgled in one place, it will raise the likelihood that a house nearby, perhaps a few doors down on the same street, is going to be hit. Very likely the same burglar. In fact, the pre-crime forecasting very often discovers that there are particular individuals that are committing these crimes, and they can predict where they're going to go next on the basis of characteristic patterns of movement. And they say that burglars often seem to act like wild animals looking for food, which is that they will return to sites that they have previously found productive until such time as they think that they have exhausted that spot, and they would better move on somewhere else. Obviously, if they've already got your laptops and iPads and everything, then there's no point in going back for a few days, give you a chance to buy some new ones before they come back and re-burgle you. In the meantime, they just go down the road a bit and repeat the crime elsewhere. Been a lot of publicity given to a policing method that is called zero tolerance. And it refers to cracking down very severely on minor street crimes, things like vandalism, graffiti, spitting on the pavement, all of that kind of thing. And another component of it, incidentally, is repairing, getting rid of the graffiti that was there already, mending the broken windows. Because apparently when a neighborhood looks run down, then it needs to be reclaimed from the street gangs. So you make it, you clean the whole place up so that they no longer feel that it is their territory to do what they like with. The approach seemed to work very well in New York in the 1990s. It was often attributed to Mayor Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, that's his era, and that's what happened to the New York crime rate as the red one. But as keen observers, you will notice that something almost the same happened in other American cities, maybe not quite as impressively as New York, but very close. And also the New York decrease in crime occurred very shortly before Giuliani appeared on the scene, so it might be that he got credit for something that was about to happen anyway. But the approach seemed to work in New York. There was a remarkable decrease in crimes like mugging and murder, even though they had only dealt with the minor superficial crimes. And it was copied in Liverpool under Bernard Hogan Howe, who you will know became the Met chief in London following the success in Liverpool, where crime also dropped by about 30%, I believe. So it's a very fashionable idea. And some researchers say that one of the reasons that it might work, and they presented evidence to support this idea, is that it's very important within gangs to appear tough. You get your status from doing things that are violent and tough and antisocial. And if you make it tough to get away with very minor things, like littering or spitting on the pavement, then they can demonstrate their toughness and get their kudos by doing the minor thing, and they no longer need to commit the major crimes like knifing a rival gang member or something. That's the theory behind it. It's one possible theory, but it does have some support. Now, to some extent, crime is genetic, particularly lifetime criminality, career criminality. A lot of people are a little bit delinquent in their youth, but they grow out of it. But if you are a criminal all your life, then it usually has an important genetic component. The evidence for this partly comes from twin studies, twin comparisons between identical twins and fraternal twins. That was 7 different studies, all showing that identical twins are much more concordant in their criminality than non-identical twins. That's one way of calculating the extent of the genetic component. The Cray twins, of course, were identical twins, both of them major gangsters. The heritability estimates range from about 40 to 70% of the variance being down to the genes. It seems like a big range, but it really depends very much on the subject pool that you put in, how wide the variance is within the population that you are studying. If it's a very homogeneous society like Norway or something, then the heritability estimates will be lower than if you are dealing with a very mixed, heterogeneous population, as with the United States or London. The other source of evidence comes from adoption studies, where if people are adopted out and they've perhaps got criminal parents, then they're still more likely to be criminal. And in fact, the criminality of the adopted child is related more closely to the biological parent, to the one that is raising that child. That's one source of evidence. However, the adoptive environment also has an effect, so that particularly if a child has a criminal biological parent and is put into a criminal foster home, then that's the worst possible situation. That really raises the likelihood that criminality will be manifest in that child. And the two effects, the genetic and the environmental effect, are additive. That is, they will summate on top of each other. So they seem to be independent to some degree. A number of particular genes have been identified that relate to violent crime in particular. These are dopamine-related genes. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter which is involved in the approach and reward system of the brain, like, I want that, I'm going to get it, and hell with the consequences. Now, these genes, which correlate with violent criminality, also seem to accumulate in poor and violent neighborhoods. And it is quite possible that the cause and effect is going both ways. That if you have the violent genes, you are an irresponsible, feckless kind of a person who tends to drift into the poor neighborhood. And of course, that will increase that tendency for crime to congregate within the particular neighborhoods that are poor. Going back to the idea that Isaac was putting up back in the 1960s, even before he fell under my evil influence, that the relationship between genes and crime is mediated by personality traits. That is, a level at which it can be observed, measuring personality. And these are the traits: thrill-seeking, aggressiveness, negative emotionality, low levels of agreeableness and conscientiousness as measured by traditional personality tests. Here's your thrill-seeking, I suppose, and the popularity of games like Grand Theft Auto. You see the connection between thrill-seeking and crime. Those correlations apply to both men and women, but obviously some of these traits are more common in men than women, and hence we have a male preponderance in crime. You could also examine them at the level of hormones, like testosterone obviously relates to some of these tendencies as well, particularly thrill-seeking, aggressiveness, impulsiveness. But there is no one personality profile that is going to go with crime, because there are different types of crime. And fraud, for example, usually it does involve psychopathy, but it tends to involve certain other traits, sociability, arrogance, and a higher IQ perhaps than burglars. What is called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, very commonly identified in naughty school children who don't pay attention in the lessons and who are very difficult to control. And there's a lot of controversy about is this a meaningful diagnosis or is he just a naughty boy? And even more controversy about treating it with drugs like Ritalin, which, although stimulants, actually result in greater behavioral control. But one thing we do know is that ADHD is very much higher in criminals, or the likelihood of it is higher. Maybe about a third of criminals might be described as having had attention deficit disorder. And a very large-scale Swedish study with a massive sample there looked at those diagnosed with attention deficit who were either on medication or not, and to see how that would impact the likelihood of them being involved in crime. There's your women and there's your men. Men who were treated for their attention deficit were much less likely to be arrested. See, it's about 40% of the untreated and about 50% treated. In percentage terms, the crime reduction was 32% for the men and 41% for the women within those diagnosed. Women, of course, are much less likely to get arrested, even if they do have attention deficit, but even among women, if they were treated, the likelihood of them falling foul of the law was reduced by 41% in the case of women, an even stronger effect that might not seem it in this data. Now, of course, there are possible criticisms of that. It might be that treatment compliance is mediating the effect. That is, that the people who accepted treatment or who found their way into treatment were somehow basically different from the ones who never were treated. And some of the variants, at least, might have come from that source rather than just a biological impact upon the brain. Psychopathy, of course, is a famous antisocial personality disorder, typified by lack of empathy, impulsiveness, sensation-seeking, manipulative behaviors, the types of things that were mentioned as correlating with crime before. And if you've got the complete package, and a lack of concern for anybody else's needs, only concerned with your own agenda, then you're likely to be called a psychopath. Around 15 to 20% of criminals are said to be psychopaths. But it is worth noting that not all psychopaths are criminals. You've got a high rate of psychopaths in occupations like business executives, bankers, charity chiefs, and union leaders, perhaps, who are functioning extremely well. Bomb disposal people have a higher rate of psychopathy. Whereas at the other end, you have caring professions like nursing and teaching, which have very low levels of psychopathy. So not all criminals are psychopaths and not all psychopaths are criminal, but there is nevertheless a certain core of criminals in jail who you would call psychopaths. And they seem to have overactivity in the dopamine reward approach system that I mentioned earlier, depicted in here, running right through the underside and center of the brain into the cortex, prompting them towards impulsive, unrestrained behaviors, combined with underfunctioning in the prefrontal brain areas of the cortex, which normally function to damp down brutish impulses and to give people some kind of sense of responsibility, control, conscience, whatever you like to call it. Areas that are concerned with moral restraint and pro-social emotions like guilt and embarrassment. Psychopaths are not capable of those particularly. That's the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the dopamine reward system. A very critical little junction there. Now, can you tell a criminal just by looking at their face? They say you can't judge a book by its cover. Well, apparently, to some degree, you can. And this was demonstrated in a study by Vella et al. I've put up a sample of their stimuli here, just a small sample, in which you've got number 3 is apparently a rapist, number 4 was convicted of assault, number 5 of arson, whereas 1, 2, and 6 are non-criminals. So they put up photographs of known criminals, and it was known what they did, and people who served as controls who had been matched on a lot of different variables like gender, race, age, attractiveness, and emotional expressions in the face. They tried to eliminate all of those as much as possible, and they still found that to a statistically significant degree, which is by no means perfect discrimination, people were able to guess which were the criminals. What they were not able to guess is what type of crime they had been involved in, whether it was theft, murder, arson, rape, forgery, or whatever. They could not distinguish one type of criminal from another, but then that rather fits with the fact that what is known about criminals is that they don't tend to specialize. If you're into one thing, you tend to be into a lot of other things. It's very seldom that you pick up a serial killer who hasn't got a background of burglary and trespass and forgery and a lot of other things in his background. Various crimes do seem to correlate within themselves. Now, one particularly interesting exception here was that women could not spot rapists. As a matter of fact, they were statistically more likely to see them as non-criminal, which leaves one with the possible conclusion that rapists have evolved some sort of camouflage that will enable them to get close to women and not be detected by them. We only have one here, number 3. I don't know what's distinctive about him, but I don't think any single instance is going to tell us very much. But whereas men would put the rapists in amongst the criminals, the females in the judging sample tended to see the rapists as being more like non-criminals. Now, there is a suggestion. We tend to think of psychopathy as a kind of a mental illness, a dysfunction of some sort. But there are evolutionary psychologists who will say, no, that's not the way to view it. It's actually an evolved life strategy that has certain genetic benefits. Provided you don't get yourself lynched or jailed for life or something, then you might actually pass more genes on to the following generation. Krupp and company found that the violence of psychopaths tends to be nepotistic. That is, they tend to direct it to non-related people. You know, the Sopranos and people like that, they tend to hit at non-family members more than their own, although that's not an absolute rule. What we do observe is that psychopaths are often attractive to women. That seems to sort of connect with that fact that women can't spot rapists. The truth is that they often find them quite attractive. And Richard Lynn has reported that criminals have more children than non-criminals. They average nearly 4 children each, compared with non-criminals controlled in every respect that you can think of, social class, the area that they live in, and so on. The criminals have, and the psychopaths, tend to have about twice as many children. So there are obviously some genetic advantages to it. You could call that dysgenic forces, although that's a rather unpopular concept, I suppose, at the moment, but they could be contributing to criminality. Here's a real cutie. This chap killed 4 people in a shooting spree, apparently, and he's one of an Omaha family that are 38 descendants of a particular individual who have been responsible for 633 crimes since 1979, and these are a few of this chap's relatives. It runs in the family, big time. You spotted your favourites there yet? Now, this chap, Trevor Hayes, was serving an indefinite life sentence when they discovered a tumour in his brain, particularly the frontal lobe area that they reckoned might have been, the tumour might have been pressing on areas in the frontal lobe that might have prevented his violence from manifesting itself, and in that sense, it would have been a cause of his aggressiveness. He was a bit of a crook, but his previous record was petty theft rather than real violence. This is a picture of him robbing a sub-post office or something, I think. That's the man himself. But the defense lawyers argued that the frontal lobe tumour was the cause of his crime, and that once that had been eliminated, he would no longer be dangerous, and indeed the judge agreed, and London's appeal court, his sentence was reduced to 11 years. The judge said he still knew what he was doing was wrong. In Italy, we had a case where a murderer had his sentence reduced because he carried 5 genes that were associated with violence. Now, this seems a little bit illogical because, of course, if he comes out of jail with those same genes, he's still going to be terribly dangerous. So I don't follow the logic of releasing him. Neurocriminology is the idea of looking at the brain basis of violence. Adrian Raine has written a book recently about it, and he says that murderers can be identified by low levels of activity in the frontal cortex, and among a number of other things, like having a small amygdala and very low heart rate, according to Raine's research. But he has succeeded in getting murderers off at least execution. A chap called Donta Page here, this is his brain. That's his brain compared with normal controls. And Adrian Raine testified on his behalf that he couldn't help it, his brain made him do it, and it saved him from the death penalty. Though Raine maintains that epigenetics are also important in developing the brain, it's not just a genetic thing, that things like child neglect and abuse, poor nutrition, your parents smoking and drinking will all contribute to the development of this kind of brain that is underactive in the frontal lobes. Here's a study showing that certain processes in the cingulate cortex recorded during an impulse control task will predict which prisoners are going to reoffend after release. These are the ones who are most likely to get rearrested, about twice as likely as those who have a high response in the cingulate cortex within an impulse control task. So there may be ways of predicting recidivism by studying brain processes occurring during certain laboratory tasks, but certainly this measure is not sufficiently accurate at the moment to make life-altering decisions relating to any particular individual. Actually, as far as recidivism is concerned, the figures are not very reassuring. That, according to the Ministry of Justice, 1 in 3 UK criminals is a serial offender with at least 15 previous convictions. Only 10% of those convicted or cautioned were first-time offenders, which is another statistic there. Criminals on bail commit a crime every 10 minutes, including 2 rapes per week, 1 in 7 murders. So, you know, it's often said, well, prison doesn't work. What it really shows is that short sentences are pretty unhelpful in protecting the public. They do work for the time that he is in the jail. In America, some states have instituted what they call a 3 strikes law, that a third felony and you get a mandatory life sentence. It's rather inflexible and has led to a lot of anomalies, draconian sentences for minor offences like stealing a pizza. It's very costly. Prison populations have been climbing, and worse than that, it doesn't seem to be all that effective, other than perhaps prompting some second strikers to move state, where they won't be at risk. In fact, it may even have resulted in a slight increase in the murder rate due to some criminals being backed into a corner where they have nothing further to lose, rather as the death penalty can. But apparently it's ineffective in that the crime rate has been falling just as fast in the states that don't have, those are the states that have never had a 3 strikes law, and those are states that do, introduced it at different times. Murder rate is falling in all of them, or crime rate is falling in all of them, regardless of the 3 strikes law. We seem to be a little bit confused as to what prison is actually for. Some people say it's for punishment, but prison is pretty unpleasant. It's a very oblique, wasteful method of punishing somebody. Some say it deters, but career criminals don't fear it very much, and it may actually be a school for crime, and that you come out being a better trained criminal from your associations within the prison. We know it doesn't rehabilitate. It's stigmatizing, it breaks family ties. Drugs are rife, coercive sex, altogether it's a pretty unpleasant situation. Suicide rate is raised 10 times relative to the rest of the community. The idea of retribution is a little bit immature, and it's often based on the outcome rather than the intent of the behaviour. The example I think of is a chap who was driving up the M62, fell asleep, his car went off the road onto a rail track, a train came, and I think about 10 people were killed. Now, he got sentenced to 5 years in jail, not because of the criminal intent at falling asleep at the wheel, but because of the outcome, because of the consequences of that. If he'd just run into a tree and hurt himself, there would have been no such terrible penalty. And it seems to me that there's something illogical about that it's done just to pacify the relatives of the people that were killed. The guy is not dangerous. He's wasting his time and the taxpayers' money by sitting around in prison. There would be other sentences that would be suitable, as indeed there would have been in the case of Vicky Price. My own feeling is that the only real reason for sending somebody to prison is to contain dangerous people. And by dangerous, I mean not just violent, but people who are, if they're out, they're going to be trouble. They're going to be burglarizing people's houses or plotting a terrorist incident or something. That's what jail ought to be for, protection of the public from people like that. Community service is a very good alternative for people who are not dangerous. It's got elements of punishment, reparation, payback to the community, which I think is quite important. And it doesn't wreck the person's grounding entirely. It's also been demonstrated to be superior in preventing recidivism. So it's altogether a preferred method. Electronic tagging also works to some degree, but there's no real payback. The community doesn't get anything out of them in terms of work. And finally, there is this question that I believe that rehabilitation is just not possible for some criminals, particularly the psychopaths. And yet, they are the ones that are more likely to charm their way out of prison by smiling at the parole board and so on. That's what the research shows. Psychopaths get early release more easily than non-psychopaths. There is debate about whether you can treat psychopaths. Some say you can, others say not. And also people are debating about whether they are morally responsible or whether they are themselves victims of maltreatment in childhood or something. Well, I have to say that I don't think it really matters very much. Concepts like free will, culpability and so on might make sense in the legal context, but they don't make sense to psychologists or psychiatrists because all behaviour is determined, whether by genes or by the environment. And it doesn't matter which is pushing and pulling you. Ultimately, your behaviour is determined by something. And we would probably be better off abandoning ideas like culpability, responsibility, and so on completely, and replacing them with just two things. One is the criminal intent. And I gave that example of the guy who just fell asleep. He had no criminal intent, but he got 5 years. That's unreasonable to me. And future risk. Now also, you know, the chap who fell asleep at the wheel, take his driving licence off him and he won't be a risk thereafter. So that if you just consider those two things alone, I think that is the logical way to decide on who is going to take those precious places in prison. Thanks very much.